Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States alone owes more than $38 trillion, a figure so large that it grows by millions every minute. Japan's debt exceeds its own yearly economic output, while the European Union collectively carries over 14 trillion. Even resource-rich nations like Saudi Arabia, or export powerhouses such as Germany and China, all owe vast sums of money. But if everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? Debt, for most of human history, has been seen as something shameful, a personal failure. Yet in the modern world it has become the foundation of prosperity, the quiet engine driving governments, corporations and ordinary citizens alike. Debt is no longer the exception, it is the rule, and the world runs on promises that are never meant to be fully kept. To understand how this happened, we have to go back, far back, to the ancient world where the idea of debt first appeared. In Mesopotamia, the birthplace of writing and civilization, clay tablets recorded loans of grain and silver between farmers, temples, and local rulers. These early debts were often secured by land, labour, or even family members, and when too many people fell behind, kings would sometimes declare a debt jubilee, wiping the slate clean to prevent rebellion. These jubilees weren't acts of generosity, they were acts of survival. A kingdom could not function if its people were trapped in perpetual bondage. In ancient Greece and Rome, debt was equally central. Greek city-states borrowed to fund wars and public works, while private debt often led to enslavement or exile. Rome built a legal system around credit, contracts, interest, and collateral that still echoes through modern finance. But even Rome learned that excessive borrowing by the state could destroy empires. During the 3rd century crisis, as emperors debased their currency to pay soldiers and wars, inflation soared, confidence collapsed, and the empire's economy began to unravel. The lesson was clear: debt could build empires, but it could also bring them down. After Rome's fall, Europe fragmented into feudal kingdoms, where credit was scarce and tied to land and faith. Yet by the 12th and 13th centuries, a new financial revolution was brewing in the merchant cities of Italy. Venice, Florence, and Genoa created a new kind of economy, one based not on gold or silver, but on trust. Merchant bankers began lending to kings and popes, financing crusades, trade voyages, and wars. The great Florentine families, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, pioneered double-entry bookkeeping and letters of credit, the ancestors of modern accounting and international banking. For the first time, money could move across continents with words and signatures instead of coins. But this new power came with risk. Kings often defaulted. Edward III of England famously bankrupted Florence's Bardi and Peruzzi banks in the 1340s when he failed to repay loans used to fund his wars with France. The message was unmistakable. Lenders could influence kingdoms, but kings could destroy them too. Then, in 1694, something revolutionary happened. England, locked in yet another war with France, found itself short of gold. The crown turned to merchants and investors, promising them regular interest payments backed by future taxes. In exchange, they created the Bank of England, the first institution designed to manage a permanent national debt. For the first time in history, a government could spend money it did not yet have by selling the promise of repayment. That promise, embodied in government bonds, became the cornerstone of the modern financial world. France soon copied the model, the Netherlands refined it, and across the Atlantic, the newly formed United States used it to fund its revolution and westward expansion. By the 19th century, debt had become a symbol of strength, not weakness. Nations competed not just in arms and industry, but in creditworthiness. London's bond market became the financial capital of the world, setting interest rates that could determine the fate of empires. The British Empire's ability to borrow cheaply allowed it to project power across the globe, financing railways in India, wars in Africa, and trade routes that stitched the world together. Debt had turned into empire's secret weapon. The 20th century pushed this system to its limits. World War I forced governments to borrow on an unprecedented scale. The United States, once a debtor nation, emerged as the world's largest creditor. But the Great Depression of the 1930s shattered faith in debt-driven growth. Countries defaulted, currencies collapsed, and millions lost their savings. Out of that chaos came a new order. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, the Allies met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global financial architecture. The US dollar, backed by gold, became the world's reserve currency, and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to stabilize nations and manage debt crises. For a time, it worked. But when the United States abandoned the gold standard in 1971, money itself became untethered. Debt was no longer limited by gold reserves. It was limited only by confidence. Governments could now issue bonds freely. Central banks could create money by purchasing them, and the line between money and debt vanished. Every dollar, every euro, every yen now represented a promise, and I owe you with no expiration date. By the dawn of the 21st century, total global debt had surpassed the world's GDP several times over. Today, it stands at more than $300 trillion. Governments owe, corporations owe, households owe. The average American carries tens of thousands of dollars in debt, from mortgages to credit cards to student loans, and yet, the system depends on that constant borrowing. Without it, economies would stall, markets would freeze, and the illusion of growth would evaporate. But who holds all this debt? In the case of the United States, roughly 2/3 of federal debt is held by domestic investors, American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, and the Federal Reserve itself. The rest, about 1/3, is held by foreign governments led by Japan and China. Japan holds around $1 trillion in US treasuries, China slightly less. Yet despite political rhetoric, America owes far more to itself than to anyone else. When the Treasury issues bonds, US institutions buy them, the Federal Reserve sometimes buys them again, creating new dollars in the process, and taxpayers pay the interest that cycles back through the same system. It is in many ways a mirror, a nation owing itself money to keep its own economy alive. This circular structure extends far beyond America. Japan lends to the United States. The United States lends to Europe through the EMF. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank, and developing nations park their reserves back in Western bonds. It is a global web of promises, a planetary chain of IOUs in which every creditor is also a debtor. The only thing keeping the chain intact is trust, the belief that tomorrow's promises will still be honoured. But history shows what happens when that trust breaks. In 2010, Greece's debt crisis nearly tore apart the Eurozone. Investors lost confidence, interest rates spiked, and the nation was forced into harsh austerity measures that devastated its economy for a generation. Argentina has defaulted 9 times since its independence, each crisis wiping out savings and destabilising governments. Sri Lanka, unable to service its foreign loans in 2022, faced fuel shortages, protests and political collapse. Every time, the pattern repeats. New loans replace old ones, the system resets, and the machine keeps running. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. Modern governments do not plan to repay their debts. They refinance them forever. When bonds mature, new ones are issued to replace them, a process economists call rolling over. Debt becomes a subscription service for the entire planet. The real product isn't repayment, it's interest, the rent we pay to keep the world running. And because this system depends on faith, not gold or resources, it is inherently fragile. Confidence can't be printed. When it falters, markets panic, currencies fall, and societies pay the price. Yet as long as the illusion holds, debt remains the safest and most valuable asset on Earth. A US Treasury bond isn't viewed as liability, it's collateral, the foundation of global finance, held by every major bank, pension and central bank. So, what happens if a major nation tried to pay down its debt completely? Economists agree, it would trigger collapse. The very act of repayment would destroy the instruments that keep the system liquid, bonds would vanish. The money supply would shrink, deflation would set in, and the global economy would freeze. In a strange twist, the world needs debt to stay alive. That's why when politicians talk about balancing the budget or paying off the national debt, they're selling a comforting myth. The goal isn't elimination, it's sustainability. The system depends on debt being believable, serviceable, and infinite. Because once belief fades, the entire structure unravels. Debt has always been about power, between ruler and subject, lender and borrower, worker and investor. In the ancient world, it bound peasants to kings. In the modern world, it binds nations to markets. When we say we owe it to ourselves, we overlook who ourselves really means interest payments flow upward, from taxpayers and labourers to the institutions that own the debt. It's not a conspiracy, it's the logic of the system. Those who own debt accumulate wealth, those who service it sustain it. The modern financial world has blurred the line between money and obligation so completely that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. Governments issue it, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens depend on it. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it means balance. But that balance is delicate, and if trust ever breaks, if the cycle ever stops, we'll be reminded that every dollar, every bond, and every loan is just a promise, and promises, no matter how well financed, cannot last forever. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Every empire built on borrowed confidence eventually faces the same question. How long can belief substitute for repayment? As long as debt is rolled over, as long as markets trust, the illusion continues. But if trust fades, the world will remember what debt really is, a promise that can't be kept forever.